radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Welcome, Fade to Black. Bespoke Radio for the masses. Yeah. How you doing? How you doing? Today's Tuesday, July 9th, 2019. 189 days into the new year, just 176 days left. We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States, hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, The Planet. I am your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? So looking forward to tonight's show. Isaac Arthur is back. And tonight, Isaac's job is to make me look smart. Yeah, man, he's great. And tonight we're going to discuss Clarketech. Isaac's got a whole video series on this, and he discusses quite often a lot of the subjects we're going to go through tonight. But Clarketech, technology's indistinguishable from magic. So that's tonight. A lot to discuss, and I'm really looking forward to this. My quest is to learn. Isaac is the host of Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur on YouTube. He's got over 300,000 subscribers, nearly 200 episodes covering topics like colonizing the solar system, interstellar travel, the Fermi paradox, artificial intelligence, other topics representing the possible future paths of the challenges for humanity. Isaac received his degree in physics from Kent State University, graduating top of his class at the age of 20, and remained there for graduate studies before joining the United States Army and serving in Iraq. He also, worked as a civilian researcher at the Air Force Institute of Technology in Dayton, Ohio. That's right. And after the military, he returned home in Ohio and serves as the chairman of the board of elections for his area when not working on his channel. The website, of course, is isaacarthur.net. I'd like to welcome back to Fade to Black, Isaac Arthur. Isaac, good evening, man. How are you?
I'm doing great, Jimmy. Thanks for having me back on.
Man, great to hear your voice, my man. Great to hear your voice. Guys like you, Isaac, sometimes I get a little intimidated because I don't have that education behind me, and I try to be self-taught and learn and acquire these very intimidating things. But with you, I'm totally comfortable, and I think that resonates through your the popularity that you have achieved on your channel, that you break this down for everybody that is out there hungry for this knowledge, but they don't know where to get it. And I just want to thank you for that, because you have a very sensible way of presenting this until you get down to those crazy mathematical symbols. And this is where I want to start. Okay, when I look at some formula, something that breaks down, you got an equal sign in the middle, right? You got these things going on both sides. Is that a secret? Is that a secret language? Is that something that prevents anybody else from looking at it? Because honestly, you could write anything on that chalkboard and most people don't understand it.
You know, I was about to say that it's not a secret language, but I think they've actually used geometry and things like that as secret languages a few times in the past. I mean, the idea with the math, of course, is that these concepts are easier done and described accurately with math, but usually feel, and it's one of the reasons why we never put anything up there much more complex than algebra, on the screen at least. If you got to use a lot of math to explain it as a concept, not to work with it, but to explain it, you're probably not understanding as well as you can yourself. So unfortunately, that does kind of break down for some things like general relativity and string theory. Those you really do need the math on those.
Right. You know, I remember you recently talked about this, and but I remember watching a documentary a few years ago on radar and how planes are tracked and how they do this accurately, and they couldn't do it until they inserted a random negative integer number in it that technically meant nothing. But it was the only way that they could get the software and the numbers to work for these very complex radar systems that are used all around the world. And I thought to myself, that doesn't make any sense. Where does that come from? And you recently addressed this, and I remember you saying something like, "Well, okay, that forget about the negative number there, but it needs to be there." Again, this adds to the mystery for most of us that don't understand math, and we get into these equations, right? What's the need for something like that? But it adds to the complexity of it, where we just can't wrap our minds around it. Isaac?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, a great example is those negative numbers. So much of what we talk about in physics, when we talk about things like wormholes or time travel or going faster than light, that all relies on negative numbers. And they work great in math, but they're kind of like accounting. And the only real excuse we have for using them is it does look like the universe sometimes engages in accounting itself. So you could have a negative dollar on a sheet of paper, but you can't really have one in your hand. And it looks like at the quantum level, at least, maybe the universe actually does let you have negatives for accounting purposes.
And negative mass. Now, we're going to get into some real subjects here in a second, everybody. But negative mass is something that we're going to discuss a few times tonight, too, as well. And to make some of these very complex theories and ideas work, negative mass comes into play. Explain that really quick, because we're gonna mention this quite a few times tonight.
Well, the one downside with negative mass is that what we call mass is actually kind of three correlated things. There's mass, inertial mass, how hard it is to push on something. So if it had a negative, an inertial mass, if you pushed on it, would come towards you. Then you got negative gravitational mass in terms of the attractive component, which is, say, it would push you away. If it was a planet of negative mass, it would push you away. But of course, you could never have such thing because it couldn't form. It would push itself apart. And then you've got the other one, which is the responsiveness to it, which would be your anti-gravity example. You don't respond to gravity when it pulls on you by falling towards things. You fall away. And if each of these properties, and negative mass could theoretically have 1, 2, or 3 of those, is incredibly useful if the stuff exists.
Right. And so, okay, now this is where I've got a list of a few questions that I want to discuss gravity first and try to simplify it. You just stated that gravity pulls.
Yes, it's the only purely attractive force we have.
But
all the others push or pull.
But yet I feel that it pushes too. In other words, couldn't it be the same thing? Gravity doesn't change, but depends on what side of it you're on.
Well, this is the big problem with gravity. It's the oldest force we know of, but we know so little about it, and it's so much weaker than the others. Some folks think that it's probably tied into dark energy, which is expanding space and time, which is what gravity doesn't do. It contracts it, right?
Right.
And then there are others who say, well, maybe gravity's leaking over from other dimensions. So that's why it's so weak. It's trying to do all of our parallel realities at the same time. And there are so many different versions of this, and there are great theories for this too. And there's so much good stuff on paper. The problem is it's all on paper. We haven't got any empirical evidence to support any of these theories yet.
Now, I've got a few things that I want to pop out there, including these questions. But when we discuss gravity, we have gravity at the quantum level, right? Mm-hmm. We have gravity of our Earth. We have the moon. We have what's holding us to the sun. The sun is moving around. It's not the center of our solar system. It's actually in orbit around a central point, too, as well. So there's gravity there. Then we have the gravity of what is holding our Milky Way together. And it just expands. But yet out in the universe, things are moving outward and they're not pulling inward. And there isn't a central spot of gravity holding everything together. So it doesn't really make sense to me that we have different types of gravity.
Well, we could make it even worse. These are the same types of gravity in theory, but we always say you can't move anything faster than the speed of light, and yet the supermajority of mass we can absorb is actually traveling away from us faster than light. So, the thing is, the gravity, to the best of our knowledge, acts the same at every scale. It's just whether or not it's dominant. When you're dealing at the quantum level, assuming it even functions right, we have no working theory for quantum gravity at all right now. There's all those other forces that are so much stronger, but those have a repulsive and attractive force, so they tend to negate out. And the electric charge on this planet's huge, but all cancels out, so gravity dominates.
And that's what's interesting to me, in that the gravity at the atomic level, what is holding atoms together, is so extreme that we can't tear it apart. It appears, well, we can. With the collider and stuff. But
well, that's not gravity. That's the strong nuclear force. One of the other three forces.
One of the three forces. But yet, the fact that we can jump up and down and pull away from gravity if we have to, right? Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't seem to be that strong, but yet it is the glue that is holding everything together at the same time.
Sure. It takes a trillion times more mass than a person has to hold your feet to the ground right now. That's how much heavier the Earth is. A trillion times more mass than us. And that's all the gravity it generates. And that's very weak when you think about it. An electric charge, on the other hand, if you had nothing but a handful of positively charged particles, that would be quite able to move like a building. We would just yank it.
Right.
That's how big the difference is. Because there's much stronger force. So I think it's like 10 to the 40th times stronger than gravity, like trillion times, and then some change. Much stronger force, but it negates out. So you get these dominant effects. The gravity is not changing as you get to bigger scales. It's how much the other forces are getting negated out. When you get to past the galactic scale, that dark energy starts to kick in. Now, that's always in place to begin with, too. We think little pockets of space-time, tinier than an atom, are popping up everywhere all the time. That's our best guess right now for dark energy, and there's a lot of guesswork there. But that's such a minor factor that, inside you, these little things will pop you up, but you wouldn't even notice. At the solar system scale, that's still so minimal you can't really notice. You have to get up to all the way to the galactic scale, where gravity is so weak pulling between these things before you can actually see this dark energy effect. So it becomes a dominant factor there.
Yes. It's fascinating to me. And now let's stay right here. If you went out, is there any part of space, any part, that has nothing in it? Empty space? There isn't, is there? And that's a misconception that many have had. Even, you can say in the vacuum of space, but there is always something present, correct?
Yeah. We've made vacuums in the laboratory that still aren't perfect vacuums, that are more empty than anything you'll find in space. Even in the voids people talk about, those are voids only in the same way that a desert is dry. They're still oases. But you can make a vacuum that has no particles in it at all, and you still have particles kicking around that pop in and out of existence, as best you can tell. That's that quantum foam and virtual particle stuff.
Right. Fascinating. Okay, so that clears up that. Let's go to the next question that I have. Light. Okay, now waves or particles and photon. Okay, but let's talk about light for a second. Does light have a half-life?
It might, but the problem is that light doesn't experience any time. So if that half-life could be 5 seconds or 50 trillion years, no time is passing for the photon because it moves at light speed. So if it had a half-life, we'd never be able to tell.
So a photon, the single element of light, not separated from a wave, right? Where we break it down to the photon level. Does a photon have a half-life?
If it does, we'd have no way to tell. Again, there's no time being experienced by that object. And it seems like it's traveling through space, but it's really just got this timeline it's on for where it's traveling in a straight line. It experiences no time. If you're a photon, you had a watch. I mean, you never see any time pass on that watch.
But this is okay. So where does the energy come from for a photon to technically exist forever?
Well, nothing's causing it to cease to exist. Energy can't be created or destroyed, to the best of our knowledge. And although things like the Big Bang and dark energy would kind of challenge that assumption, but in general, energy can't be created or destroyed. You can absorb a photon, shine a flashlight on something black, it gets absorbed. But left to itself, it would just float through the void. Nothing's affecting it, so there's no change. That energy just stays there. Except it's not really staying, it's moving in that straight line, of course, towards whatever that photon's destination might be.
Okay, so when light reaches us from 8 million light years away, right? So whatever it is out there that is reaching us, that will continue past us forever.
Unless we absorb it. Yeah. Cosmic microwave background radiation. Everyone's heard about that. That's stuff that's left over from when the universe was very young. And when it was made, these microwaves are very weak energy sources. When it was made, it would actually have been visible light or high infrared. It's redshifted. It's gotten weaker with time as it passed that distance.
Right. Now, a flashlight, which you brought up earlier, why does a flashlight dissipate over distance?
Well, those are where it's spreading out. And that's a common misconception about laser beams. People think it was a beam that stays tight, but it actually doesn't. It's just like a flashlight, only it's way, way tighter. So it will stay point-like or thin for a much longer period of time, but it is spreading out from the moment it leaves the laser. It's same as a flashlight would. It just takes a lot longer to spread out, and that becomes a problem when you're trying to use lasers over long distances for like pushing spaceships or sending signals. You need to ramp up the power because it stays a lot tighter, but it's ultimately really just a much more focused and collimated beam.
But again, are the photons from a flashlight existing forever?
Yes, left themselves, they will exist forever. They just spread out as they go. The beam gets weaker, just like if you step away from the wall while holding it, it will get dimmer on the wall.
Yeah, because it's cone shaped.
Mm-hmm.
The beam
so is a laser beam, yeah.
And the laser beam is too, right? So if okay, all right, still a little
code.
It's still a little confusing to me in that everything has got a half-life, right? That's what we've been told.
We don't know about that. We thought the proton did for the longest time, but the problem is that, as best as we can tell, its half-life, because we assumed everything's got to have a half-life.
Right.
But as best we can tell, protons, if they have a half-life, would be trillions and trillions and trillions of years. We never absorbed one decaying. Now, with a photon, it's actually a little bit more problematic because it could have any half-life it wants, but it's frozen in time. It's the same as you would say if I put somebody on ice, they should only live 70 years. But while I've got them frozen, they're not aging. Photons the same way. If it has a half-life, it wouldn't be able to actually ever decay because it's frozen in time.
Now, okay, so let's talk about electromagnetism for a second. Is there a half-life involved with that?
EM's the same thing as photons, whether it's a radio wave or a gamma ray or some of the really high energy things that might have been made by the Big Bang or by a super collider. Those are all fundamentally photons. They all act the same. That's the electromagnetic force.
And so EM, again, I know that I'm bringing you down to my level in answering these questions, but these get to be confusing subjects for a lot of people. So
Sure.
staying on EM for a second, EM, which one of the fundamental forces, if it is present, it will never go away. It lasts forever.
When it's a photon, yeah. A magnet or an electric only thing, like static electric charge, that can obviously dissipate. Though the energy there isn't going away. It's just changing what type it is.
Now, will EM in metal dissipate over time?
It will get absorbed by the metal. I mean, that's how everyone's listening to us right now is listening on radio. Those photons get sucked up or emitted, yeah.
Right.
The
Fascinating.
game changes the moment it touches any metal, it changes.
Right. Okay. I feel a little better. I feel like we can move on. Okay. Before we get to the break, I want to do a couple of things here. And one is, since we're discussing Clarketech, here's a quote that Arthur C. Clarke used to use, and it's this. It's attributed to a JBS Haldane, but the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. And Clarke used to say this quote quite often, and of course attribute it and give credit back to Haldane. But the actual quote is this, quote, "I have no doubt that in reality the future will be vastly more surprising than anything I can imagine. Now, my own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we supposed, but queerer than we can suppose." And that is from his paper, Possible Worlds and Other Papers, published in 1927. That comes from page 286. That's a pretty fascinating quote, isn't it? And I think that it not only applies to this show tonight, but it applies to you, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We try always to talk about what science tells us about the universe and what we can do inside known science, but I and everybody else just takes a given that we're going to find out the universe is a much stranger place than we think it is.
Is there a day that goes by that you don't realize that this quote is stronger than it was yesterday?
Oh, no. There's always something new. And a lot of times it's not really so much new in the sense of something groundbreaking. Those tend to come a little bit less frequently. But if there's a day that you don't get surprised by the universe around you, it probably indicates you're in a grave, which might be surprising too.
Well, then we have Clarke's 3 laws. And the first one, which... it's funny because the fans of the show post these quotes up quite often in Twitter. But his first of the 3 laws was when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. His second law is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And for us tonight, we're going to be discussing his third law. What is his third law, Isaac?
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
I love that quote. I love that quote. And if you think about it, now it's one thing to go into the future and talk about future tech and science and physics and quantum and go there. You need to just look into our own past and think about what these cultures who had never seen a boat before, right? And see a boat coming at them from the ocean. That's magic. And that's exactly what Isaac is talking about, right? Isaac. Isaac. That's exactly what Arthur C. Clarke is talking about, right?
That's a great example. These technologies, that we all expect to maybe get invented one day, probably won't be like we're thinking they will. So we want to be careful saying what is and isn't possible. But at the same time, we always have to kind of look at what we know is possible first and see if there might be some way we can approximate these technologies till we get them, if we ever do.
With Arthur C. Clarke, we're not going to be specifically talking about Arthur's science fiction tonight, but he had a vision of the future. And if you go back and look at some of these conversations that he's had, I've tried to watch all of them and listen to all of the interviews that he's done. I literally have. His vision, I've read all of his books. His vision of the future turns out to be so spot on. How impressed are you by that?
He is really good at predicting things. Some folks have a tendency to predict stuff and tend to be a lot wrong. I make a point of almost never trying to predict timelines on things for that same reason.
Right.
Clarke had a knack for it, and I think a rare one because he was a scientist who wrote fiction. Whereas, that really helps. You get a better idea for what really isn't too realistic in your settings. And so he just had a knack for seeing what was going to happen next a lot of times. And that's a lot of the fun of reading his fiction, is you can see how he hit the mark or just barely missed it, or in some cases got it completely wrong, which is no negative on him. I mean, who's going to predict the cell phone and texting? It's just not there. And that's a good model for us to use when we try to predict the future on the show, is always remember those little tiny things that nobody saw coming that will just rock the world entirely in some small way.
When there's a scene in 2001, the famous video phone scene, right? Bell telephone and the video booth, and he steps in the phone booth, but very nonchalantly takes out a card, pops it in a card reader, right, and has a video call with his daughter, who happens to be Stanley Kubrick's daughter, who plays the part there. But that small scene, a minute long, was a complete vision of the future, and it was complete and came to pass. When the movie came out, it was so science fiction and so out there. Today we watch it, and it was just it's normalcy, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. There's so much of that there are other parts I wish were already true, like actually being on the moon by 2001. But, he was just so good at nailing those little things that we just wouldn't even expect to see. Yeah. And that the movie is full of things like that. And I'll give Kubrick credit for that stuff, too, because he was actually very good at making those visuals resonate with their importance.
And Arthur C. Clarke very effectively. Now, I do believe that he was also a product of his environment and his friends and other scientists and science fiction writers that he hung out with. But he nailed the internet. We can talk about geostationary satellites. That was an obvious thing. But high-definition TV, you just mentioned texting and email. But little things like booking your online travel, right, and shopping, and ebooks and smartwatches.
You think of HAL as an early form of Siri or Alexa.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And back then we looked at all of that as like magic, like it. But we got to it, and we got to it very quickly. He was just amazing the way that he did it. Now, I want your really quick. I've got 30 seconds. Your definition of Clarketech, because you do a series on this. What is Clarketech?
Any technology that we can sufficiently explain as a concept, but for which we don't have any clear pathway to with existing science.
Now, we're going to get into all of that in just a bit. Well, let's take our break right here. Our guest tonight is Isaac Arthur. And you can go to isaacarthur.net. All of his videos are there, his YouTube channel, isaacarthur.net. The links are at jimmychurchradio.com. You can also follow Isaac on Twitter. We've got his links up right there in the feed. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Here we go. Isaac Arthur is our guest tonight. The subject, Clarketech. Yeah, man. I can't wait for this. Isaac, let's go. First up on the block tonight, force fields. Force fields. We've all seen it, right? It's an easy thing to do in science fiction and in movies. We've got to get our shields up. But there's one point with this that I would like to ask you about. We've got natural force fields right now that are protecting us, this planet. We wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the force fields that we have around this planet. Why is it that we know that they exist, but we can't apply it to planes and trains and automobiles?
Well, of course, we could make a magnetic field around the trains that would mess up everybody's phone reception pretty good. The problem with a lot of these is it's very energy consumptive, and for something like a force field, what the force field around Earth does, the magnetosphere, is mostly cause ionized particles from the sun to bounce away, and for ionized particles in our atmosphere to bounce back down so we don't lose our atmosphere. Ionized being anything that's got an electric charge because it's missing one of its electrons, right, or it has an extra one. And that's very handy for keeping ionized particles from working. So if somebody hits you with like a particle beam, like they have sometimes, or a plasma gun, a magnetic shield like that on your belt, which you could conceivably make, be hard to power, but you could make it, would work. You could use something like that to prevent someone from hitting you with a plasma gun or a particle projectile. But all it's going to do is affect anything that's actually got that big electric charge relative to its mass. A bullet would go right through that, same as the shuttle falls through the planet's atmosphere.
Right, and in the movie Dune, where they've got the personal force fields, right? And it's
that movie.
Yeah, it's a great scene in that high-speed stuff, bullets, or even they demonstrate the knife, but slow-moving objects pass straight through it. I kind of want to address that for a second. Is that reality? Is that something that is achievable?
Well, I think the idea there is that in order for the folks to be able to breathe while they're inside that, they have to tune the shield generator so air can get through. And of course, if you had something that could produce fields like that, you might be able to make it selective. But most of the ways we normally think about making a force field like that probably won't let you do that. The trick, though, is really if you want to make one of these things with known science, assuming no something else new, you kind of have to take a step back to the medieval concept of what a shield was, which is a big chunk of metal between you and a target. And we were also talking about the shield around the Earth. The big shield around the Earth is actually the atmosphere. That's what keeps most of these meteors from hitting us, because they go right through the actual magnetosphere. The magnetosphere helps hold the atmosphere in place, but it's all those little pockets of air that actually keep us from getting hit by micrometeors all the time. So when you're looking at something like a shield technology, that might be something where you'd say, have a bunch of little tiny drones that were transparent, just like the drones we have now, only smaller, that flew around with radars and would just jump in front of any object they detected coming towards you. And that's, bang, a shield. That's all it necessarily takes. Something like a magnetic field, your ideal shield that's supposed to stop everything, that's probably not too realistic. But you don't have to necessarily have only one type of armor on you. So for something like that, you might use a magnetic field to produce to keep you safe from plasma guns, and you might use mirror shielding on your own armor to protect you from lasers, and you might use little drones that flew around to keep you safe from bullets. They jump out the way or fire tiny bullets at the bullet. So you have to do kind of an overlapping process. But the ultimate idea of a shield, which protects you from damage, that's probably doable. You just have to improvise a bit.
Now, okay, so now let's talk about our Starship Cruiser, right, out there flying across the galaxy, and we encounter another ship, and we put up our shields. Now we're suggesting something else altogether, aren't we?
Oh, yes. And in this case, it might actually be handy to have that magnetic shield. You might have that on a ship anyway because there's so much ionized gas just floating around out there in the void that you're ramming into at a good portion of the speed of light. And, of course, you might want to have something there that protects you from things that weren't really ionized, little tiny dust grains that might hit you like a nuclear bomb at those speeds. There, your shield is really more of an active shield. It's a radar that's out there looking for everything you can see, and then you shoot the little things with lasers as you go by. But that's a good example with spaceships is they're not going to park and shoot at each other 10 feet away like we often see in sci-fi. They'll be flying by each other at very high speeds for very quick moments. And so they probably almost have to use things like laser beams or particle projectors. So you might be able to get away with those shields that were reflective or which were magnetic and devoid anything that was charged like that. So you might actually have shields like that to some degree. Not quite the Star Trek shield, but similar.
Well, the problem that I've always had with those shields is that, you know, when they bring up something that surrounds the ship, is that they can see through it. I've always had a problem with that, because if you can see through it, that means they can see you and they can shoot through it, right? That's explain that part of it to me. Does that just make that cartoonish, that is complete fiction and something that would be impossible?
Somewhat. I mean, from a conceptual idea, it's the right notion. From a military angle, if you've got a weakness in somebody else's armor that they're using, like a visor on a helmet, that's exactly where you focus your attacks at. Same for the gate on a city wall, that's where you go bring up your battering rams. And so that's the right kind of notion. If you got a shield like that where it blocks out a certain frequency of light that you're using to detect things with, you might constantly cycle what frequency that was on, so the enemy didn't know what it was, but you could still shoot through that while they're trying to guess which frequency you're going to use next and shoot through that themselves. You can still see through that on that one wavelength. And so with something like a shield, we don't know how we do it yet, but we can still discuss it this way because we know what it's supposed to be doing. And so we can get an idea what the weakness is. Something like that, you might also have a tether on a little camera at the end that was excluded from the shield that you could kind of like let slip out through the edge of the shield, and that was what you were seen by.
Right.
How would you go about making something like that? And usually you have to be able to play with something like negative matter or gravity to be able to pull that off.
So a real force field would actually be the most effective idea from this, would actually end up being something that you probably couldn't see through. And then that would defeat the purpose of the force field, because then you couldn't see outside of the ship. You'd look out of the window and you would have a solid wall there.
Yep. The only way you could get around that is if it was like a one-way meal, or which is conceivably possible, or if it was that it lets you see in certain frequencies. And of course, they'd have to be ones you could change, because if the enemy knows what frequency you see through, that's the frequency they're using for all of their lasers. Right.
And let's go to the other side of this, which is weapons and laser weapons and photon weapons, handheld weapons. Is this Clarketech? Is this something that because we hear about laser weapons now that are being deployed in our own military?
Mm-hmm. But usually the laser weapon's purpose is not to actually cause much direct damage, although sometimes you get like a kinetic kill on a missile, a really powerful laser that just burns it out. But by and large, we use them to, enhance aim, things like that. The problem is that a laser doesn't really have that much energy in it, and anything you can use to actually power that is usually very bulky. And you'd almost always be better off instead taking that energy, running it through a magnetic field and shooting something out, what's called a rail gun, or on the channel, a whale gun.
Right.
And that's usually a better bang for your buck in terms of energy. You throw a chunk of metal somebody's way instead, that you put that same amount of energy in as kinetic. But a laser weapon that's just there to burn a hole through somebody, like we usually see with a laser rifle or pistol in sci-fi, that one's probably not on the radar. What you'd see instead was somebody that did something like suck air out, solidify it, and shoot that at somebody instead.
No, I've got a laser over at the house, right? I've got a crazy high-powered laser that I use to track ships when we're out doing sky watches, night watches at night with night vision goggles. That laser that I have it can burn you in a second. If you pointed that at your skin and you hold it on, it burns you. But it's a constant thing, as opposed to with this future tech where you see these lasers running in slow motion, right? You see them, and they're running so slow, it looks like whoever's being shot at can dodge the bullets. Yeah. They can dance out of the way.
The funny thing is that might actually be appropriate when scaled up a bit, because if these ships aren't tens of meters away or kilometers away, but rather engage each other light seconds away, then they might be able to dodge as the scale's messed up, because you wouldn't be able to see those ships. Or if you were, you'd be shooting at some ship that was several thousand miles across itself, in which case you probably don't want to be fighting that thing.
Right. And so with a laser weapon, you wouldn't necessarily even see the beam of light, right?
Nope.
Not like in Star Wars, right, where you're seeing these, hand-to-hand battles going on with these shoulder-fired and, pistols and stuff. You're seeing the beams of light, but in reality, you wouldn't see anything, would you?
Well, yes and no. If you're actually using one high-powered enough on the ground to shoot somebody and bore a hole through them, the amount of scatter off of that would actually probably give you some visual effect you could see. And then, of course, there's also the augmented reality thing, which is a big excuse for video games with sci-fi, is why you can see the other guy's ships, is you're not actually seeing real space, you're seeing the computer's version of that it shows you so you can pay attention properly. But and that's kind of hand wave you might actually see people use in the future too, is all the ships look like they're only right next door, even though they are thousands of kilometers away, just so that the human mind can kind of process it properly. But in space, there's almost no debris. Now, if they're fighting long enough, there might be enough debris and gas around that they could actually see the laser beam scatter. But no, you don't see one of those until it actually hits you, and you don't really see it at all from the side. And the only way to dodge a laser beam is to preemptively dodge it, which the only way you can do that right now is to randomly walk. You're constantly jittering back and forth on the assumption someone's going to take a shot at you, so they don't know where you're going to be at. But you don't know when they're going to shoot at you until it arrives, so you have to be constantly doing that, and that takes a lot of energy.
I have seen demonstrations of laser beams, burning up a ship or what have you in target exercises right now. I can't see those laser beams.
No, they're usually not even in visible frequencies. I mean, the spectrum is huge, and typically speaking, the visual spectrum is not a good one for lasers unless you're trying to use them to use like a laser pointer, because those frequencies are the things that get absorbed by almost everything we think of as normal chemistry. That's why we use them to see by.
Explain that to me for a second.
Well, you got the frequency of light varies a lot by wavelength, and by and large, the frequency of light, its wavelength, is very similar in size to whatever's actually emitting it process-wise. Like gamma rays, very high-energy things, they have a wavelength about the size of an atomic nucleus, which is typically where they come from. X-rays are about the size of that inner core of electrons around most atoms, and that's what emits them, too. Most of the things that we think of as visible light, or infrared and ultraviolet, which are those same types of light, they just have to be on either side of the part we can see. These are chemical lights for the most part. These are the kind of things that interact with normal chemistry. And by and large, that's what makes it useful to see. Alternatively, something like radio waves. You can have a radio wave, like an ELF one, such as the subs use. The photon of that is about the size of a planet. Every little tiny individual photon.
Right. And how does it work? And we're going to move on for in just a second. But when observatories are firing off laser beams out into the Milky Way to measure the distance of stars and to do these kinds of things, with the dissipation that happens over distance, how do they keep that laser focused so they can work if they are jumping out 100 light years away? That's a vast distance. I don't understand that part of it. It seems like at the receiving end, that laser beam would be, millions of miles wide, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And of course, usually when we're using telescopes, or I should say emitters that are really condensed like that, that's not to detect things ourselves. That's to send a message. You can use a laser on something like the moon or Mars and get a useful piece of data, but the others will take, years or centuries for that beam to arrive, and you're not going to detect it when it bounces back. It'll be too scattered. But if you want to talk to somebody who's, a radio transmitter that's 50 kilowatts, you can hear that halfway around the continent with a good normal antenna. But that stuff falls off with the inverse square. So if it's 10 times further away, it's 100 times weaker. If you want to hear people from another solar system, you either need a dish, that's ginormous, or they need to send you a really concentrated beam. So when we try to send signals off to other planets to see if there's anybody there, we concentrate as much as possible to save power. You could do an omnidirectional broadcast with that, but it needs a lot more power, and you'd have problems hearing even our best radios with our best equipment more than a few light years away.
Yeah, now that made sense. That I understood. And I want to get into communication and travel right now by jumping into wormholes. And the concept of wormholes has been talked, since I was a kid in the 70s, where wormholes started to become a subject of conversation. Has there, at this point, has it gone beyond theory? Has there been any wormholes detected?
No. We're actually increasingly certain they probably can't actually exist, at least in any sort of useful fashion. That's one of those examples of things where it's predicted by general relativity, which has been so good at predicting things so far. But so are white holes, for instance, as opposed to black holes. And as best as we can tell, they probably are never stable if they do happen at all. Though there are some exceptions to that. There's actually a working theory called ER equals EPR by Leonard Susskind that posits that there might actually be a wormhole between every electron, that these things might be, ridiculously common. But we probably could not use them to send information or send mass through. And there's a problem when you look at these things from a math standpoint is if you ever feed a wormhole more matter than it's got making it up, if you try to put through too many ships at war, it should collapse, even if you're actually using all the cheats like negative matter that would hold it together to let you use it.
So let's get into the theories behind wormholes. If we would have to make our own?
Yes, almost certainly. If we wanted to use them, we'd have to make them ourselves, and we'd probably have to have negative matter or energy to do that with. From a black hole or wormhole standpoint, energy works as well as matter.
If you were going to build a wormhole, your own, what would you use it for first?
I would probably use it to send myself a message on how to construct them, because they're all time machines. So what happens is you theoretically have to make both sides of it. You're making the two next to each other. And if you move one of those gates to some place that's useful, which you have to do at sublight speeds and very sublight speeds because these things are massive. These are not things you make in a room. These are things that are usually outmass a solar system. You move that point somewhere, and it's undergone time dilation while you did that. If you drag it back home after you moved it away, you're going to go in one gate and pop out before you left.
Okay. If we built a wormhole from here on Earth to, pick something, Sirius B, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's where we want to go. We build that. Could that be seen? Would we see the wormhole? Would somebody else see the wormhole?
Yes. Most of the ways you would normally make a wormhole involve so much mass going into the thing that you'd see all the emission out like it was a gigantic black hole, because that's basically what they are, is gigantic black holes. And you would absolutely see that. And then, of course, a white hole, which theoretically might be on the other end of these things, which we've also never detected.
Right.
Those are, the exact opposite of black hole. All they do is shoot matter out. You can never get out from behind a black hole, but you can never get into a white hole.
Yeah, and the difference between, we build our wormhole between here and Sirius B. When we travel through it, does anything change with us physically? We know what happens down to a singularity with a black hole. We're ripped to shreds.
Yep.
What happens when we travel through a wormhole?
It should be like just falling down. The problem is it's kind of dubious if you can actually build up enough speed to keep going. The idea is to make sure you don't fall into that singularity, which is where the negative matter comes into play. But imagine if we took the Earth and we drilled a hole down through it, all the way through, and right through the core. If I drop you down there, people wonder what happens when you hit the center. At the very center, there's no gravity, of course. But you just keep falling down, but then you'd oscillate right back down again. You never stop falling. You'll fall through the center, rise back up, fall back down again, rise back up, and oscillate. And in order to actually get away from that, you'd have to apply some more speed. So in theory, while you're traveling down one of these wormholes, if you gave yourself a big kick of speed while you're in it, you should have all that energy you had falling down, building up and speeding up, plus that little bit of thrust you gave yourself that could let you theoretically exit, maybe kind of sort of.
Yeah,
There's a lot of maybe kind of sort of with wormholes, I'm afraid.
So what would you do at the other end? Like reach up and try to grab the edge so you don't fall back?
If you had that kick that would actually let you get out from inside the event horizon that nothing can escape from, you should just emerge on your own at that point in time. That's the problem, though, is you could get through that wormhole to the other side, but you're probably going to fall right back down into the wormhole again.
So what does this do with all of the science fiction writing out there about traveling through a wormhole?
It mostly makes it not work. To really make something like a wormhole work at all, you at least need negative matter or energy, which is least on the table. But probably the more realistic approach, you want to say realistic, would be to have a new bit of science that lets you play with gravity directly, your anti-gravity or gravity things. And at that point in time, you don't necessarily have to have something like negative mass. What you could do instead is, make a big long relay of gravity generators that just concentrated space-time down in a line, and you just run along that line. You're not technically going faster than light. It's the same as like with the warp drive. You're condensing space in front of you, only in this case, it's like a highway. You'd be driving from one solar system to another, and it's expressway. It's a much shorter distance you actually have to follow, even though it looks to everyone else like a longer distance. And that doesn't break the whole FTL thing. But that kind of gravity manipulation, which is kind of the idea behind a wormhole in the first place, is the sort of thing that would actually let you do something like that, if we could get that to work. So gravity, very interesting force, so we can ever actually control it, but we don't know how to yet.
Now, what about traveling in something that has got energy, like a ship that has got thrust? Could that go through a wormhole?
And that's the general idea, would be that you're falling into this black hole, you pick up energy, and you can apply more energy when you start rising up out from the other side of the singularity, which you've managed to somehow not encounter.
Right.
The problem with the singularity is we call it that because it's what happens when you divide by zero. There is no mathematical solution at that point. Everything starts to break down. How do you divide half and half? What's twice infinity? Those kind of math problems. It takes an infinite amount of energy to get away from a singularity, if they actually even exist. How do you get an infinite amount of energy? So you have more energy now that you've passed through it and are rising away, but you still need an infinite amount of energy to get away. And, that's one of those infinity plus one questions. We don't really know how that works out. And it's also one of the reasons why we tend to be dubious as to whether or not there really is a singularity. It might just be ultra-condensed matter down to the Planck scale.
And I love the word Planck scale. You just lit up Twitter. We discuss this so often on the show. But what about the other concept of this, like Stargate, which you love and I love and everybody loves, but they walk, right? They walk through it, and then they're covering these vast distances instantly, but they're on their feet. Now, is that the same concept? Is that a wormhole?
What they discuss it as I think they say it's specifically not actually a wormhole, but basically it's a wormhole. And that's probably about the right way to look at it. The wormholes that we see, that we theorize about, which, to be fair, is kind of stealing the name because it more popped up in science fiction as something different that we said, this is what a wormhole is.
Right.
If we got that gateway thing where it's just a two-dimensional thing, and by the way, a wormhole that we'd actually have in real space would be three-dimensional, look like a sphere. But there's nothing that necessarily says that if you got gravity manipulation, you couldn't maybe make something that was two-dimensional instead of one-dimensional. Might save you power. And of course, we have no idea how to do this, but that's the kind of your ideal transport system. And one of the things I liked about that franchise, they said, wait a minute, why do we even have spaceships if we got this gateway? And so these are just delivery systems. And that is one of the problems we often have with wormholes, is you make them and then you have to take them to the location. Handy for communication and travel inside an empire, but not so handy for traveling to new places.
And the speed, what is okay? Let's talk about Stargate for a second. You can answer. I've got 30 seconds. What is the speed that they are traveling at with the example of Stargate? Because now we're not talking about FTL, we're talking about redunculus, right? It's a whole nother speed altogether.
Ironically, they'd be moving at walking speed. The whole idea of the wormhole is that it's shortening the distance between those 2 points, so that they aren't actually speeding up or exceeding the speed of light. That's one of the ways that wormholes and warp drives get around FTL, is that they are not actually breaking that rule at all. They just kind of seem to be from a practical standpoint.
And we're going to discuss that when we come back. It's a very important point that we need to address here, because time travel and FTL with these examples, take things to a whole nother level. We need to get through all of that. This is Fade to Black. Our guest tonight, Isaac Arthur. We're talking Clarketech. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Isaac Arthur is our guest. We're talking Clarketech. Now, you need to go to isaacarthur.net. The links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. Just click after the show tonight, head over to his YouTube channel and his website and get it on. It's absolutely amazing. I spend way too much time there, Isaac. way too much time. But let's talk warp drives. And I recently, I'll send you the link to it. I have it somewhere. I'll send you the link. Listen to an interview with Miguel Alcubierre's description of how he came up with the science to put this all together, because it has been talked about for a very long time. It's not like it's a brand new concept. But it's pretty incredible. And to hear NASA's announcement, as you well know, I think it was last year, maybe a year and a half ago, talking about the development of a warp drive engine is pretty exciting stuff. And this isn't really outside of the realm of physics, is it? This is something that could actually be built.
Possibly. And it's got some options there. It's not forbidden by physics. In fact, it's kind of a consequence of what we think the quantum theory is. But it's one of those ones where it runs in that quantum gravity issue where we don't really understand what happens with gravity at the super tiny scale. I think when Sonny White's talking about it as an idea from NASA, one of the things we're interested in there is not just using this for FTL travel, but for using it just for its very fast ship propellant, for a conventional drive, but very quick. And the idea there, and this, I was saying white holes don't exist earlier on. When you're making one of these warp drives, you actually end up riding between a white hole and a black hole. And it's a very dangerous motion method.
Well, yeah, and that we're getting ahead of our skis here. The white hole, black hole concept has been suggested. But before we get to that, the idea of how a warp drive works, I'm going to do the simplified side of it first, and then I need you to help me explain what they're actually talking about. But the concept is that you are removing space in front of you, you're cutting it out, you're replacing the space behind you and adding space, and therefore cutting the distance between where you need to get to. You're removing the space, which essentially instantly puts you where you need to go. That it's not faster than light. This is a whole other concept. You're not traveling at the speed of light. You're merely cutting out in front of you the distance. Now, am I explaining that correctly? Yes.
It's interesting, though, is it's probably a bad name for it because we always get warp from Star Trek, and that's, that looks like motion. What you're really doing is, it's somewhat of a flawed analogy. Think like a submarine when it sucks water in the front and spits it out the back. You're kind of doing that only with space-time. You're compressing in front of you and expanding it behind you. And what's neat about this idea, it doesn't violate FTL at all. You're not even moving yourself. But you're covering distance. What's neat about it is that it is actually allowed under what we know about science, because we know that gravity does contract space and time. And we know from the existence of dark energy that you can expand space-time. And we also know from our theory of expansion for the universe that you can move things faster than light this way, and that it's a cheat, but cheating's okay in this case, if you can get it to work.
Right. And so what does this do? We'll get back to the warp drive in a second. But jumping back to Star Trek or the Orville or any of these science fiction movies and books where they do this kind of travel. So you're in the Orville, right? And you're zipping around, vap, and you're zigzagging across space on a mission. What does this do to relative time back on Earth? We all understand the concepts of Albert Einstein, traveling at the speed of light. You and I have discussed this many times. Mm-hmm. And then you return back to Earth, and now you're a time traveler. You're in the future. If you're out there on the Orville doing these fantastic light speed jumps, Earth is no longer part of the equation, I would think, in that you're bazillions of years in the future when you're done with this.
Well, you'd expect that from the normal stuff, but this actually is the real cheat that we always think of where you're just moving faster than light with no time consequences. Because, again, you're not moving. You're not experiencing relative motion. You're just sucking space-time in and out the back, as it were. So your watch looks the same as anybody else's back on Earth's watch, unless you're moving yourself normally, too. You could be moving while you turn one of these on and still get some of that time dilation. But this object doesn't work by you moving. It works by moving space underneath you, as it were.
No,
so,
yes. But that's not what I'm actually asking. What I am suggesting here is that in like a TV show like The Orville, where they jump up and they're not using a warp drive, they're using speed, right? And so by doing this time after time after time, when they come back to visit Earth, is that a misrepresentation that Earth is still on the same timeline after they're out there running around at the speed of light?
Well, if they're moving around at the speed of light, they wouldn't actually be experiencing any time at all. But if they're moving really close to the speed of light, that's the usual case where it slows down. If they're actually moving faster than light, it's not they're going to come out in Earth's future, they're going to come out in Earth's past. That's just how that works out. Anytime you're going faster than light for real, actually going through space faster than light, as opposed to warp drives or wormhole methods, you're not going forward in time, you're going backward in time.
Okay, so now back to the warp drive. The time that we are talking here with a functional warp drive engine, let's take Sirius B, for instance, right? Or you know what? Let's even go closer. Let's go to Proxima. Okay, let's go to Alpha Centauri. 4.5 light years away, and we're going to use a warp drive for that. Speed of light is 4.5 years, right? We know this, right?
Yep.
Okay, warp drive from Earth to Alpha Centauri is how long?
Potentially a microsecond. I mean, it depends on what you're looking at with the model and how powerful the system you're using is. You can cross galaxies in a second with the thing.
So you wouldn't even know that you traveled because the ship itself, I want to understand, isn't actually moving, right?
Nope. All you're going to see in front of you is a gigantic white field, and behind you a gigantic black field until it stops and you're somewhere else.
So the time element, the time travel element of it, does that come into play with a warp drive?
No time travel with a warp drive. Although there are some ways you can play with it to get a time travel effect, but by its default nature, that's what lets work is that it's not screwing around with any of that.
So when we're talking,
it's almost more like a teleportation system.
Yes. It's mind bending when we think about this in concept. Now, E.T. Let's talk about E.T., an advanced civilization out there. If they have warp drives, and we're talking, the size of the Milky Way, which is positively ginormous, right? Mm-hmm. We think it's small. It's not. It's huge. Our solar system is huge. But to travel across the Milky Way with a warp drive, technically, in concept, is instant.
Close to it, yeah. But it's not just the Milky Way. It would be all the the universe.
See, I was going to get to that in a second. Okay, that's my next question. In that, okay, so traveling across the Milky Way would be at an instant, and so that removes any of these conversations about how long it would take and food and necessity, everything.
Makes it worse than that, yeah.
Right.
Because normally we say you grab every star you can along the way that's even vaguely usable to you because it's closer. But if you've got a helicopter over an area and you're trying to pick the best settlement, you don't go for closest, you go for best.
Right.
And you got the entire universe to pick from. Your colony isn't out, so it's not a sphere that expands from your homeworld. It's, wherever you find best.
So technically, going from galaxy to galaxy or to the fringes of the universe, the same concept applies. Instant.
Mm-hmm. Close to it, yeah. Not quite instant, but very close to it.
Would you have to do it in stages? Would you have to? Would you have to? Yeah. Would you have to warp? Go from point to point.
There are so many of the uncertainties even on the math side of this. Like one of the versions that we think might work would be where you're basically putting down a feed line in front of you, like a railroad track, and you'd actually have to build that at sublight speed, and that might be the only way you could get it to work. Basically, building yourself this trackway of negative matter along the way. In which case, that goes right back to the same thing. It's great for communicating like a wormhole. It's great for keeping an empire across the stars intact.
Right.
But it's not so great for building one in the first place.
So now that sounds too good to be true, right? In concept, it's just too good to be true.
And it probably is too.
So there's got to be some a downside or two. We're going to get to that in a second. But let's say that this is possible. What about objects that would be in the way? You're removing space, but what if there's a star in the way? Another planet?
You're going to slam right into it.
Right. You can't cut that out.
Yeah. And it's not just that, those things you're running into. You've got all that gas and other things along the way that you're slamming into as well. Although that's kind of least of your problems in a case like this because the ship's engine itself ought to kill you the moment you turn it on.
But, okay, so is calling it an engine, a warp drive engine, is that a correct use of the term?
I suppose. I mean, it's kind of debatable. If you think of it as an engine for moving space-time around, then yeah, but a warp drive's the usual thing, so that's probably more accurate.
Right. And so with a warp drive ship, you would also have auxiliary engines, right? You would have traditional chemical engines because you would have to still move. You'd have to dock. You would have to, right?
Probably. I mean, if you were really good with it, I suppose you could, but I'm not sure anyone wants you docking with their space station by warping space-time right next to them. So probably you need conventional engines.
So what happens at the other end? What happens when you arrive?
Assuming you weren't killed in the process of using it, you should just pop out of space. Well, I shouldn't say pop out of space. You should just stop moving, as it were.
But
you turn it off, and there you are.
Do you just appear?
You would seem to, yeah. I mean, because you're going fast in light from the perspective of anyone watching you. You're just going to pop right out of space at war.
Now, what happens to you and I when we just appear? Do we slam into the window in front of us? Right?
Not quite. Now, what would happen is all of that light that you emitted normally along the way is going to eventually catch back up to you. So they'll see a ghost image, as it were, following you in when you arrive, but they'll see you arrive before your light got there, so they'll see that first. You turn off, and all of a sudden they'll see you arrive. Things are more complicated on the inside of that, and there's also the possibility that you might blow up their solar system when you arrive too.
Now, describe what the ship would actually be. Is it enveloped? Is it in a cocoon?
The usual thought is that you go for a spherical bubble because the biggest problem with these things from a mass standpoint is trying to keep this really stable, perfectly stable field, because if it's not totally homogeneous, you're going to have bits and pieces of yourself moving at different rates. That's not good. So you want a perfect spherical bubble if you can, or perhaps an ellipsoid. And so that does tend to give that shape that we often see when we look at artist renderings, these where they got the big cylinder around it, that kind of thing. On the inside, though, the ship could be shaped however you want, though you want to be really sure whatever you're building that ship as, that it's not doing anything that's going to mess with the geometry of that field. Anything mess with the geometry of that field, you are dead, assuming you weren't killed again the moment you turn it on.
Well, okay. So at that kind of, and speed is the wrong description here for the audience, but let's say let's use energy. To do that, to travel that amount of distance, I would only assume, like anything else, physics has to come into play. We have thermal considerations too. And if you're inside of a bubble, you would have to have the most massive air conditioner known to man.
Uh-huh. Theoretically, you'd need something to get rid of that energy as though you were inside a star.
Right.
I mean, that's exactly the problem with these things, is that that white hole in front of you is just nothing but raw energy coming out at you. And there's no way to block that. You are compressing space-time in front of you. And that's causing everything in front of you to blue shift like crazy. And so, much as we said, like when redshifted light for cosmic background radiation, it keeps getting weaker. Behind you, that's kind of what's happening. In front of you, everything's going the other way. It's blue shifting. It's getting way more potent and powerful, and it's slamming into you.
Right.
All that energy is hitting you right now that you would have had to pass through normally. And that's just one of the many ways that thing can kind of cook you. The other problem is that you probably need to involve enough energy on something like this. I mean, it's debatable. We're not really sure how much energy you need for this. There have been debatable models. Most of the original ones that looked at this idea, because it's been kicked around before Alcubierre did it. But usually the assumption there was that you need to be working with at least planetary masses for a ship. They've gotten versions of this that work on paper that might only require maybe a ton of negative matter. And so that's the other problem there. All these things are very energy intensive. And there's usually not a cheat for that. The universe is really touchy about violating energy conservation except in its approved of ways.
Well, it's totally. And if we, which we're, when we get into the quantum side of this, all of it, not only mechanics and theory, but entanglement, if you're traveling those vast distances of space, you're covering those vast distances, what happens to the entanglement of things that are around you? How about the entanglement of your own body? Does that come into play? Do you overheat? Do you dissolve? I mean, what happens? You
almost certainly will from all the radiation in you. But remember I said a moment ago, the geometry of that bubble has to be perfect.
Right.
It's the same kind of idea as what happens with a black hole. If that force on you is not homogeneous, uniform, the same everywhere.
Right.
If that space-time is being warped a little bit different by your finger than your head, when that little difference is light years of distance, you're going to get obliterated, even by the tiniest little lack of homogeneity about that field.
Does the entanglement possibly go away? I mean, okay.
Could you entangle somebody so they actually would stay together when you got them there? That's kind of a teleportation notion.
But you've got a black hole behind you.
You have an event horizon behind you. We'll say a black hole because that's more or less the same concept, but you can't see anything behind you because the light can't reach you. I mean, you're running away from that light faster than that light's covering the distance behind you, and thus you see nothing. When you turn one of these on, everything behind you goes dead black because none of the light can reach you from behind you anymore. You're moving away from it too quickly. And everything in front of you gets compressed because all that light's ramming into you now that would have taken a much longer time to have reached. And it's all super blue shifted.
And what about going back to entangled? If you've got a black hole behind you, certainly there are entangled particles inside of this sphere, maybe even inside of your body, that are getting sucked into the black hole, the other half of these entangled particles.
With a virtual particle pairs in a case like that.
Yes.
Anytime you have an event horizon, and it's a tricky thing with event, Hawking radiation or things like that. Folks think it's the black hole that's producing these. That's not quite what's happening. These things are popping up all the time. This insane amount of virtual particles. This is normally the pairs that wander back into each other and self-destruct. If you have a big enough difference in the force in some tiny little atomic space like that, it can rip those particles apart, to use the virtual particle analogy, which is a little dubious at times.
Right.
But it can rip those apart. So that event horizon behind you might be spewing out insane amounts of radiation as well.
They would have to because they were entangled before. Technically, they're still entangled. If they change, then what is with you is changing. Right? Inside the bubble.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got the it's always that conservation of energy issue with these. Going to the wormhole example real quick, common things people say with the wormhole is, well, we can use that to make a perpetual motion machine, right? I take one end of the wormhole and stick it up in the air, so an object falls down from the one thing, falls into the other end of the mouth of that wormhole, comes back out the top and picks up more speed. But when you actually run the math on that, it actually won't. If you do the math on the wormholes, the ball falls down, hits the bottom, and slows back on its way up, just as though you were lifting it back up again. So there is that conservation of energy issue. And there's that other problem with warp drives. Almost everything involving them would tend to require you to have some kind of infinite amount of energy. Seems like a singularity requires an infinite amount of energy to escape. And that's okay on paper, although that's actually problematic on paper too. But where's that infinite amount of energy coming from?
Is there a way to overcome all of this? Like I said, it's just too good to be true that you would literally flip a switch and you go from one galaxy to the next in an instant. You don't have time travel. You don't have food issues. Everything is just taken off the table. You just arrive instantly. It's too good to be true. With this other stuff where it sounds to me like if you flip the switch, you may go, but you're going to arrive as a piece of charcoal.
You should be completely atomized in the process.
Right,
right. I would say, I mean, we don't want to rule it out because it's too good to be true. Many of the technologies that we've invented to our ancestors would be too good to be true, and yet we have them anyway. The ability to talk to someone on the other side of the planet instantaneously, that seems too good to be true. But it is. We got it. So we can't say it's too good to be true, so it's impossible. But at the same time, we also have no way to figure out how we could do it just yet. We've got it on paper as an idea we might be able to get working. But there usually has to be something that there's a couple different ways it could be made to work if you can find one of these impossible materials or impossible methods. But until we actually have one of those, we can't make it work. And if we get any of those, though, almost no matter what you do, you're going to have a technology that's too good to be true that actually works. It doesn't matter if you can get a warp drive to work. Almost any of the technologies associated to that are going to be amazingly awesome.
Could you, in NASA's concepts of this, are we talking about something that could be, like a CubeSat, some small version of this that would, be put up by SpaceX or whatever and low Earth orbit and then turn around and go to Alpha Centauri and return, but it would be the size of a toaster? Or is that not... conceptually, that couldn't be possible because of the energy sources that would be needed. How would you prove it?
You have to actually make one of the things work. Maybe you could do it inside a lab with just a tiny amount of negative matter if you find some and just get the thing to move from one side of the lab to the other. And that's one of the things we play around with a lot of times when we're doing quantum entanglement or other things to see whether or not you can actually do things faster than light. You do a very tiny thing that requires virtually no energy first. But there's a possibility that there is a real minimum size on these. And I think I mentioned that we've seen versions that might let you be as little as a ton, which is a modest spaceship to make.
Right.
But other ones back in the day, we always say, well, you want a wormhole. You need something that outmasses the sun to begin with, which makes it kind of useless for traveling around solar systems.
Now, yeah, right, exactly. So you and I, we warp drive out to Alpha Centauri. It's 4.5 light years away. How do we let Earth know that we arrived? Because communication is a whole different matter. You can't warp drive voices, or can you?
You can't. You need that machine. It's kind of like one of those science fiction ones where you can't communicate by a beam. You got to go there and talk to them the old-fashioned way. So you'd warp there, and then you have to warp back, or send a signal back to let them know. Your force probe might be one of those things where you send it, and it's a one-way trip because you don't know how to. You can't automate it to come back. And you have to wait 4.5 years to find out if it worked. And it might be a good deal longer than that because I'd imagine a prototype would be very hard to actually aim.
So that's what you would do. You would warp drive back an iPhone with a recording on it. We made it.
That would be the idea. Yeah, you need a smaller secondary drive you could send back to let people know you'd arrived. Or you just jump there and jump back and say, look, we succeeded. With a recording, obviously, let them know you succeeded.
If what's the biggest obstacle here? Is it heat? Is it cooking ourselves? And it seems like there would be a way around that. But for you, what's the biggest obstacle with the reality of a warp drive?
I mean, into the story for both wormholes and warp drives is you need negative matter or energy, and not like they often put in tops of articles to say we've discovered negative energy, though they found something that acts like it from a chemical point of view. It's not actually holding any of the properties of negative matter or energy. Even with things like the Casimir effect, that's only a relative negative. It's like on math. You say, well, I'm at a net loss this year, even though I brought in a lot of revenue. That's an accounting negative. You still brought in a positive amount of revenue. A lot of times we say negative energy, that's what we mean. It's negative only relative to something else. If you can get a single particle of negative matter, just one, that would tell us that this is probably possible to do in some fashion. And even if that one still turns out not to be possible from a pragmatic angle, any negative matter suddenly becomes insanely useful as something we can make if we can make it. But that's the big obstacle. For any of these things to be possible, you have to have negative matter or energy.
The warping of space is easy to visually represent with a planet or a star. And we've all seen the grid that bends around it, and that example of that's a visual. But with a warp drive to bend space in front of you, you would have to have that kind of mass. Unless I'm misunderstanding the concept here. You would have to have something in front of you with a suggested mass to bend that space or to remove it, right?
Or that amount of energy. Fundamentally, it's energy, not mass, that's doing the compression. But yeah, and then the mass is a very dense form of energy. You have to have all that to pull that off. And most of the ways around that are trying to figure out how you could do it, just a tiny little bit of it. Because if a little bit can sometimes be just enough. But if I wanted to warp space in a significant fashion, normally I need something much more massive than a star that was, compressing space a lot. And we can see that compression effect, all that gravitational lensing we use in astronomy. That's this effect in action. The warp drive is about being able to do that without having to carry around, a galaxy's worth of matter in front of you, which doesn't make for a good spaceship.
Let's take a break right here. That's actually the best way to put it. Let's take a break right here. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Isaac Arthur. We are talking Clarketech. I'm not done with warp drives. We're going to have to come back and pick up where we're leaving off right now. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Isaac Arthur. Tomorrow night, Jason Quit with his new drone footage from Italy. We will be discussing that tomorrow night. Thursday night is another Fader night with open lines all night long. Tonight, it's Isaac Arthur. Isaac, discussing wormholes and warp drives. As I paint these pictures in my mind about what we're talking about here, I see a lot of similarities in that with a wormhole, you need to construct out in front of you. With the warp drive, you are also doing something in front of you, removing space to move forward. And you have to do something in back of you in both cases as well. And there is no time travel or time dilation or speed of light that is in both cases. Are they that similar? Are we? And if you were a betting man, which one would happen first?
They are actually that similar. I mean, they're not quite the identical concept, but they run on that same basic principle. But I would actually tend to favor the wormhole idea, but probably not a wormhole inside of our universe. Probably one to a different universe.
Yeah, see, my money would be on warp drive. My money would be on warp drive. The burn to a crisp aspect of it, I see as something that we could that we could overcome that. And I realize I've heard all of the different theories that have been applied to the warp drive that just absolutely makes it impossible. Then there's many we haven't touched upon other aspects of it. But I would say that the warp drive is very achievable.
It seems like it's manageable in terms of little bits and pieces, each one of which is hard to deal with. But maybe if you just beat that one, you can beat the next one, and so on. Yeah, from that perspective, that would seem to make it more plausible in some ways. Whereas the wormhole seems like something where you either get it to work or you don't.
Now, are we? Let's get into the physics aspect of this. Are we violating anything In the natural aspect of things, physically, you and I, if we were traveling in a warp drive equipped ship, would we change physically? Is there something that we're messing with nature? Or are we staying on the good side of the fence in the laws of physics?
As best as we can tell, yes. That's what's cool about the system. It doesn't violate any known laws of physics other than arguably energy conservation and having material that probably doesn't exist.
Such as?
The negative matter. We don't know for sure how negative matter would act, so it might be really hard to find the stuff since it's not going to, it's not going to clump up anywhere. It emits negative gravity as a war, but we don't have any of this stuff, and we have no real reason to think that we do off of math. And math is great, but you always want that empirical evidence. It's so easy with math or logic to predict things and say, oh, that has to be so. But until you've actually got a chunk of the stuff, all it really is fundamentally speculation. Very well calculated speculation, but it's still what it is. You need that empirical proof that you've got it, and so you need that one atom of negative matter.
Now, is negative matter the same as antimatter?
No. Antimatter you've got all over the place. In fact, every time you eat a banana, you've got some antimatter involved because that's how that potassium radiation is generated as a beta decay. Antimatter is something, for some reason we're not sure about, was created in much smaller amounts when the universe was formed, or not actually much smaller amounts, enough that everything else got obliterated except that left over some regular matter as a war. And the name antimatter is in some ways a really bad name because it implies something kind of negative or reversed when it's really just a less common type of matter, probably locally.
With negative mass, isn't there an equal amount of negative mass with regular mass in the universe?
Well, that would be a thought that's been kicked around, that the total amount of energy in the universe might be exactly zero.
Right.
And that's actually been thought about with things like antimatter too. That we don't know if the universe has a net charge. If it actually has more positive than negative charges, it might, but it looks like it probably doesn't. And we can always say that because we don't see any overt signs that there's an imbalance. But it could be off by a few electrons even. And the question is, why are we assuming that it's exactly even? And we have this example of antimatter. As best as we can tell, when the universe formed, there should have been an equal number of all of these particles, regular and antimatter. But there wasn't. Maybe there are other chunks of the universe we can't see where antimatter is the more common, and we just got all the matter locally that was of that variety. But that's an example of an imbalance. There was more of this than that when we would guess that they'd be the same amount. And so with something like negative matter, maybe a very tiny amount of it was made. But we like to assume with a lot of these ideas that it would be exactly equal, that it would all negate out. And that's kind of an example of logic preceding evidence. We figure it ought to be net zero, but where's the evidence to back that up?
Now, let's talk about the concept of, I want to move on to time travel and teleportation and a couple of other subjects. But one of the obstacles that has been brought up about the warp drive is, now we all understand and have heard of absolute zero, right? And in the vacuum of space. And that's really, really cold, right? Well, it's the ultimate cold. It's absolute zero.
It's so cold it doesn't exist anywhere.
It's really cold. But then we have the concept of absolute hot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Temperature.
What is absolute hot? Most people haven't heard of this before. What is absolute hot?
Well, we were talking about Planck scale earlier, which is like the Planck time or the Planck length, and these are very tiny things. And not all of the Planck units, these are fundamental things you put together from the physical constants. Not all of those are actually small. Like a Planck mass is actually about a microgram. It's not really impressive one way or another. But a Planck temperature is the maximum temperature you can have. Everything above that, all the physics would break down that we have going on. A Planck temperature is like a trillion million degrees, something along those lines. It's a very, very large number, even compared to the insides of stars. And we think that might be the temperature the universe was when it first got spawned. Nothing should be able to exceed that temperature. And that's one of those quantum things where we were saying earlier about singularities and you can't divide by zero. the universe doesn't seem to like the number zero or the number infinity. It doesn't really seem to present us examples of that. There are limits to how much you can cut things in half. There are limits to how small you can make an object. And indeed, that is that Planck length or that Planck time. If you make something down to the Planck length, it's pretty much automatically going to be a black hole. If it's got any energy in it at all, in terms of like photons, anything that can be that small has to be so energetic it would be a black hole at that size. Planck temperature is the exact opposite. It's one of those maximums that would seem to be imposed by nature, that you can't exceed this temperature, that there is no infinite temperature, but that's an actual maximum.
And one of the dangers of using a warp drive would be the possibility of achieving that scale of hot. Right?
Yeah, right in front of you, probably. That's one of those problems you have with things like white holes, is that might very easily be what temperature they are.
And how would you overcome that?
How do you overcome standing next to a nuclear bomb when it goes off?
Right.
And this is much worse than a nuclear bomb. Much, much worse, And so you say, well, I've got this really powerful energy source in front of me. I'll just bounce it away. How? I'm not sure how you would do that. It's like standing in the middle of the Big Bang. Actually, it is literally standing in the middle of the Big Bang.
Right. And so absolute hot, if we get to that point, then everything ceases to exist. Right? Everything breaks down.
Well, or something new pops up. I mean, again, Big Bang.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Absolute hot. I've been looking into that lately, and again, it's when we talk about the surface of Mercury or the surface temperature of the sun, or these extreme things that
peanuts in comparison.
Right. Because we wrestle with that heat, right, in our mind about how great of a temperature that actually is. Well, when we go to absolute hot, it's just like talking about ice cubes and then going to absolute zero. That is a crazy number of cold. Well, we have the same extreme with absolute hot, and it is a mind-numbing number of heat, of degrees. Mind-numbing. How many zeros?
Like 30 of them, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe 32. It's a huge number of zeros. Trillion, roughly. And, it's interesting. You can't quite get to absolute zero. That's what we have as a theory right now, is there's a minimum temperature you could get to. It's real close, but not quite there. And this is the other kind of the side thing. How close can you get to infinity? Well, you can't get really all that close because you're never close to infinity, but this does look like as much as you're going to get. And again, it's one of those problems that pops up when we work on these things on paper. We can see infinities and zeros on paper. We can calculate around them. But usually the universe doesn't actually let us have those.
Is something like a supernova or some extreme explosion out there that, the brightest things that are out there in the universe, are those achieving absolute hot?
No, not even close. They might be doing so afterwards when the supernova collapses into a black hole, because that's probably, assuming for the moment that there is no singularity, no actual point-like center of a black hole, that It just collapses into something really, really tiny at the Planck scale. That matter should be at Planck temperature.
Incredible. I feel smarter already. Okay, let's move on to let's do time travel. And right now, where is your head at when it comes to time travel?
I don't think it will ever be possible.
Why?
Fundamentally, time travel is about cause and effect, and that's the same problem we have with FTL, because it always seems to allow you to violate causality, what causes things to happen. Anytime you have time travel, you get the more obvious logical issues, like when what year was time travel discovered? Every year simultaneously, because you can go to whatever year you want. If time travel were possible, and this is kind of a deductive back way, if you could actually make a practical time travel, somebody should have shown up when the universe was brand new and colonized the whole thing by now. But then there's the other aspect of that is, either someone invents time travel and they've only got the only working time travel machine because they can go back before anybody else would invent it and keep them from doing it, or you've got everybody constantly doing it. And then there's the other aspect people overlook, is that conservation issue. What happens when I move myself back in time? there's all that matter, all those atoms in me, they're somewhere in the universe already. Now they're there again. How does that work? The universe has a finite amount of matter in it, and now it has finite number plus some number of 100 kilograms, whatever it is.
But aren't you removed from the future? Doesn't it stay constant?
Well, that would be a violation of a conservation of energy, right? If I jump back 100 years, right, as a physical object, I've moved backwards. The universe 100 years ago is now 100 kilograms heavier, and the universe 100 years from now is 100 kilograms lighter. That mass being energy, there's less energy now. The universe has suddenly gained energy and lost it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's impossible. We don't know that conservation of energy always has to be preserved. In fact, we have some reasons to think it might not be. But that would be an example of why it might be impossible, is simply because there you go. You've created or destroyed energy.
But that's okay. That's one version of time travel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I understand that concept. And there is another part of it that you didn't touch upon, where I talk to very bright individuals, where they're referring to a time machine aspect of this, where you're literally choosing the time and you're going back. Well, then what happens to the rest of the universe? Right?
Now, is it that maybe it would get closed off as a kind of with these event horizons that we always talk about with black holes? There are plenty of other event horizons, like the edge of the universe that's observable. You might find that any place you were doing time travel in got its own new event horizon around it, kind of closed itself off.
Right. Well, and so would let's say we have a colony on Mars. I'm going to keep this really simple. We have a colony on Mars, and you and I jump into our time-traveling phone booth, right? And we go. Yes, I made that reference. I just did it. And we jump in our time travel phone booth, and we go back in time. Does Mars go back in time? And what kind of energy are we actually talking about here, where we are reversing the gears on everything?
In most versions where you're going back in time like that, to actually do it under known physics would require an infinite amount of energy, so you couldn't do it.
Right.
If you're popping back, though, as we mentioned, whatever energy you had in your body or whatever you're moving back in time, that's got to get transplanted, which is quite a lot of energy. So it might be that if you wanted to send somebody back in time, you had to pay that energy bill, which would be a very large number. That whole equals MC squared thing. The other is that you might be able to create these kind of closed loops. Wherever you invented the time machine and started that up, you could travel back in time only to the moment when that was created. That's kind of how that works with wormholes. You can make two wormholes, drag one end away, give it time dilation, bring it back, and there you have a time machine, but it only goes back to the moment that wormhole was created. And we don't actually know what would happen at that point in time. We just have some guesses, and one of those is the Nokia self-consistency principle, which is that you could change time, but you're always going to come back to the same event to prevent all the things like, well, I went back in time to save JFK, but then why did I go back in time to save JFK if he'd never been shot? One way or another, by the Nokia self-consistency principle, if that's true, you would always end up back in a moment that caused you to do that closed loop, as it were, which is more science fiction than science as a concept, to be honest, but it does, that's one of those logical extractions. That doesn't necessarily mean you didn't change time, though. It just means that it always proceeds back to something that's going to cause you to do that same event. It might be that you went back and saved Kennedy, but something happens in your timeline that makes you believe that he was actually shot, even though he wasn't. So delusionally, you jump back in time to save him, even though it doesn't need saving anymore.
The concept of time travel that I wrestle with the most is the going back in time is the unachievable. That's where things get complicated. That going to the future is quite easy, and Einstein has clearly said that. Okay, I get that part. But what I am confused with is that the past has happened. We know the past is there. The future hasn't happened. So that would be more complicated to me going to the future. There's a
problem there, too. We assume that there's an infinite number of futures as well, and that there was just that one concrete past. But the same kind of reasoning that gives us multiverses and multiple futures says there's also possibly multiple paths. That there are many different potential paths that would result in this exact moment. And there's the other aspect of time travel where say, well, if I jump back there, I'm only jumping back to a reality that's very similar to mine. Now it's a new universe. And of course, if I just add a bunch of energy to it, it certainly is a new universe. It's not the same one. It doesn't have the same properties. It's got an extra amount of energy in it. And under those, you're not traveling to a different part of your own time. You're just traveling to a universe that's very much like yours.
If you upset the amount of energy or the amount of matter and you tip that over, what would happen? I mean, do we just dissolve? I mean, do we have a reversal Big Bang?
That has been suggested, that you might actually cause one of those vacuum fluctuations they talk about killing everybody, which is an interesting one because that is not instantaneous. That would spread outward at the speed of light, we believe. So you create this doomsday scenario where the universe is being destroyed at light speed. So somebody doing in a galaxy right now far away from us, millions of years from now, the wave would finally hit us.
Right.
But that's a possibility, is that you might just unravel that. But then, of course, if you unraveled that universe by having done that, then how do you travel back there? Because that universe doesn't exist anymore to produce you to make that time machine. And that's one of those timey-wimey things, I think, to use the phone box reference.
Well, see,
it doesn't make much sense.
And if there is the practice of these concepts that are going down in another galaxy, pick the number, not the Milky Way, another galaxy, where you've got advanced civilizations messing around with the fabric of space-time and our time traveling and dissolving energy and all of that and matter, would that be something that would affect us here and we wouldn't understand what was going on?
Possibly. That's one of those things where, it just depends on how the universe reacts to this. It could be that it's entirely possible to engage in time travel. And indeed, there's nothing banning that under general relativity. What's violated, what you're not allowed to violate is causality. Cause and effect is what can't be violated. That just usually bans time travel. But it's possible that if you start playing around with these things, you would create a event horizon around yourself that would basically insulate everybody else from you. And again, there's not a lot of evidence to back that up because there's not a lot of evidence to back any of this stuff up at this time. But that is one of those situations that happens. If you've got a universe that's structured to prevent you from violating causality, it might be that time travel is possible, but every time somebody's about to discover it, they essentially edit out that moment. That never happens. They never actually get around to discovering it because things correct themselves instantly. You've got this thing where he invented it, went back in time, and prevented himself from ever inventing it. So it might be that that's one of the things you could never invent, even if it was possible, because you'd never actually get a chance to invent it, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And okay, now jumping into the future, which you and I have discussed, but let's do this in a very simplified way. We zip out, we go FTL, we go 99.9, right? 99999. We're right there. And we head out. Let's pick an achievable number. Let's do a 20-year round trip. 10 years out, 10 years back. Earth is now at 99.999. Earth is 1 million years in the future. 1 million. And we come back here, and time travel is now a tourist attraction. It's a destination. Right now, what happens to us? We come back. Is it possible to go from the future, remove ourselves, time travel back to 2020, where we can tell everybody that time travel is possible? Now, what happens to the matter that has been removed and the energy that has disappeared from the future?
We have no idea. That's one of those problems you get with time travel. From a logical point of view, when you're dealing with like civilizations, the Fermi paradox, if I invent time travel a century from now, the first thing I ought to be doing is traveling back in time to modern me and handing me the blueprints for all the really expensive technologies that will make me a trillionaire, right?
That's correct.
But I haven't done that. And it's like with the Stephen Hawking party for time travelers. He announced it was the day afterwards. He announced the party was last night, and nobody came. Of course, they say, well, maybe they have a rule against not doing it. They can do it, but they don't. I said, well, yeah, like, you could do that, but find me a rule that people voluntarily follow 100% of the time. And I would say that that's probably not going to. I would consider that to be more impossible than time travel itself. You know.
Well, and this is the. I don't want to get into paradoxes because I don't believe in any of them. All right, because nobody's time traveled. This is all just theories and ideas. That's all it is. I entertain all of them, but I have my own concepts too as well. And let's stay right there. We go back in time, and we do visit a paradox. We literally kill our grandmother. Let's not say that they don't have sex. Let's just say I take out my grandmother, right? I take her out. At that moment where I now cease to exist, what happens to me? Do I disappear? Do I turn into stardust? Do I fall down and die, and my physical body is still there in the past, but I just drop dead? What happens at that moment?
I mean, we don't know for sure. If Back to the Future is anything to go by, you'd start to kind of fade out and see your hand go away. But from a more realistic perspective, it could never have happened, right? You went back there, you shot her, and now you never exist to go back there and shoot her. And that, again, that's where that Nokia self-consistency principle comes in, where it says, if you could actually have gone back and done that in the first place, maybe something's going to happen that would make you do it anyway. Like it turns out that in this new timeline, you've merely been deluded into thinking she was your grandmother. You were wrong. It's not your grandmother you went back and shot at all. Because that's a possible timeline, right? Or somebody came up to you and lied to you before you got in the time machine and said that that was your grandmother you were going back to shoot. And say, well, that seems to be kind of contrived. And it's not the idea that the universe is consciously making that happen. It's more the idea that of all these possible futures that could happen, that would be consistent, that would actually have allowed that. There are an infinite number, or a very nearly infinite number of scenarios that could cause you to go back and do something like that in a way that would not violate, not create a paradox. There are very few of these relative to numbers of normal universes, but there's still a huge number of them. And so there would be an alternate universe in which you had done that mistakenly, where you went back in time and shot the person who you thought was your grandmother, but actually was not. And that you would just end up in one of those paths for the same reason that water, when it falls on a hill, one way or another, it ends up at the bottom of that hill in the ocean again. It can take many different paths to get there.
See, this is okay. Now, this is my idea. Are you ready? This is church time travel theory. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. I travel back in time. I pop a cap in my grandmother. I still live. I time travel to the future, back to where I was. I'm still there. There isn't an alternate me. There isn't a younger me. There isn't a twin me. None of that happens. All of the other stuff, all the paradoxes, the alternate timelines, the infinite, none of that happens. It's just all normal. There is no paradox. That's what I'm saying. Life continues.
Well, that's another one of the ones they will sometimes present is that, the time motion thing that we have here. You went back in time and changed something, and time continues to just proceed normally. There's no paradox because you still have that one timeline. It just kind of loops like a string. You've got a straight string, but who says you can't take your finger and cord around your finger real quick and make a loop in the middle of that string? You're still walking along a straight line with that string, though.
Yeah.
It just happens to intersect at one point and loop.
Yep, that's what I honestly, my
that's
whole
as valid a theory as any other ones out there.
I mean, my whole take on it would be, I've got to take a break right here. I'm already running late. Is that I would come back, I'd look at you, I'd tap myself. Wow, I'm still here. I just killed my grandmother. I'm back. Life is unchanged. That's my take. That's my take, and I'm sticking to it. Let's take a break right here. When we come back, let's talk some teleportation. Our guest tonight is Isaac Arthur. And it's very simple. IsaacArthur.net. The links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. If you're enjoying this, you need to go and check out all of Isaac's videos and presentations. It is fascinating. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Fantastic conversation tonight with Isaac Arthur. But we expected that. Heading into a little overtime. And Isaac, thank you for this conversation tonight. It is just incredible. And these thoughts and concepts for a lot of us are it's mentally draining because we are getting into an uncomfortable zone and knowledge. For you just rattle this stuff off, and it's just another day for you. But teleportation is another complex issue, and we've been watching this magic occur. Going back, I think most people remember Star Trek, but my first memory of this is way before that, probably by 10 or 12 years in Forbidden Planet.
Love that movie.
Yeah, love it. I still watch it all the time. What's funny with Forbidden Planet, it gets shorter and shorter. The movie happens very, very quickly for me now. It's a time travel teleportation thing. In that it is just so well laid out, and the vision of the future was just incredible, and also the GPS aspect of it, where they've got the ship in the middle of that dome and traveling the universe. I thought was a very interesting concept too, as well.
Well, the Forbidden Planet, there's a great example of that for things like teleportation, where you've got the Robbie the robot who's making all this stuff for them out of nowhere. And I think it was a bunch of bottles of whiskey for the cook was the example he used. That's one of those ways you can do teleportation, is you just go ahead and print out a copy of a person at the destination, which kind of raises the issue of what happens to the original guy. Is that really just long-distance cloning? And when we start looking at teleportation, what our ideal version is that here you are and now you're elsewhere. And that one seems like it would be kind of problematic to actually ever make work, but we have a lot of things that come real close. And one of those would be where we scan you in and copy you somewhere else. That's a lot easier to do with somebody who's not really human anymore, who's been mentally uploaded onto a computer chip. But you always have that problem that whenever you're doing things like this, you're not actually moving that person, you're copying them. What do you do with a copy? Or was the copy destroyed in the process of scanning? And if you're using a method that tends to destroy things when you scan them, what happens when you do a scan and it doesn't work perfectly? And is it still the same person if they're not quite copied perfectly?
Would some advanced form of error correction have to take place?
I think so. Well, you've got a compression issue first. Almost everything in your body is a copy. Say you want to send every last bit of information of a person's body about them, every last molecule or atom. How accurate does that need to be? Do I actually care if it reassembles a bit of fat that's not the same as a bit of fat elsewhere in my body? There's only so many types of fat. It wouldn't really make much of a difference.
Right.
Same for muscle. Can I just rely on that as encrypted? Can I just send along a thing that says, make 1.5 pounds of alm in this place? It's the same template alm as everybody else has. And then, of course, how good of a copy is that if you're compressing that much? And you almost have to, because say, well, maybe we won't do it at all. We'll scan literally every atom. And so there's a problem there. They are, 10 to the 30 or so random atoms in your body. If each one of those requires a very high-powered photon to reach your destination, a very high-powered transmission, when you're sending that beam with all that information, it would be not just very energy-intensive to make. You're basically firing a death ray at the location just to send all that information.
It's a huge amount. We're not talking terabytes, right? We're talking about a crazy amount of data.
Yeah. If it's not compressed, it almost has to be compressed to only be a digital copy of the brain. If you're trying to send the states of every last atom in that body, you are effectively sending a signal that's got to be so powerful just to contain all that data that it really is a death ray.
So the concept would be an easier concept for teleportation is you would have a generic body.
Pretty close to that, yeah. You'd upload a brain to it as well. Or you'd merely replicate the specific states of the neurons. You're recording what those neurons each have. That's problematic, though, because we don't really know how much. You'll hear figures about how much memory we need to simulate a human brain or processor speed. Those are kind of guesses. We look at how many neurons there are in the body and how many connections they have and say, that's our ground state. We don't know for sure if that's actually the case. There might be levels beneath that are actually relevant. And so if you're not copying somebody perfectly, and there's, what is perfect, how close do you need to be to actually achieve the goal? And of course, you can make the argument that I'm not the same person I was when I opened my mouth to say that sentence. I'm constantly changing.
That's right.
So.
That's right.
But how much is enough for the change?
Well, how much is enough for you? Right, for you to say yes, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this. In that, if they said, well, it's going to be 99.9%, that's not
close enough. Yeah.
Not for me.
No, not for me either. And I mean, there was presumably a part where you say, well, look, if I've just got one tiny little data point different in my head, so that I remember one extra leaf on a tree I saw 10 years ago, that can't possibly really matter. So that's probably good enough. But if you teleport somebody and it's not quite a good enough copy, for how good of a copy does it need to be? And that would obviously depend a lot on the individual. So there are examples where you might use teleportation, where it's very compressed like that, where you're really not getting rid of the original person. It's just a rapid copy, kind of like of an export, But since you still got that speed of light issue for most types of teleportation, you might say, why don't I just keep a bunch of exports on ice with my my spaceship to travel to another place, and I just wake them up for that occasion? Because that's a lot more data you can carry around that way.
Well, and the problem that I see with it, and I want to talk about the amount of data here in just a second, is that that's teleporting one time.
Yep.
But then you walk, right, and you walk into a bar and you see somebody at the end of the bar that his hands are shaking, maybe his skin is wrong, and you're like, oh, that dude's teleported 25 times, because now the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy and the degradation that happens in your digital file through so many error corrections, data loss, and compression.
And it's not like normal cloning. Like if I just want to clone you, I don't get fatigued because I can keep using that original sample or even repair the damage because we know what a damaged bit of DNA looks like and what it's supposed to look like when it's right.
Right.
How do I remove the damage of a copy on someone's memory? That's one of those gray areas there. If you teleport someone and they are, you're making a copy of them. You're making a copy of them now, not the copy of them that you teleported 10 times back. So you could get copy fatigue very easily, especially because when you start to think about how you go about scanning somebody at that kind of resolution, that's a pretty destructive process if you want to do it at any kind of real-time speed.
and so the amount of data, okay, here in the bunker, I'm running, I have wide open, very expensive gigabit internet. Okay, and what we are running here is extreme. Okay, it's rare. Okay, not too many people have what we have here. But to run this kind of data down a pipeline, how long would that take? Okay,
an atom by atom scan, potentially billions of years. Now, just for a copy of like someone's neurons, it was like 10 to 6.
Did you say billions of years?
I think I might be going low too there. I'd have to run the numbers on the specifics for that, but yeah, it's a very long time.
Yeah, because we all remember downloading, with dial-in modems, right, and looking at a picture and watching the stages come down, and then finally you got a JPEG on your screen. When we are talking about this kind of data for a teleportation situation where you and I need to go to Paris, right? We don't want to fly. We want to teleport to Paris. We could fly there quicker than the teleportation side of it because of the data transfer would take forever.
Yeah, and there's also the heat angle on this because, running computers is not energy free. You could accidentally melt a planet down by actually running one of these things. There might be that much energy involved.
Right.
Now, that's for the atom by atom scan. If you're just trying to do a copy of a memory, right, a copy of the brain, that potentially could be something you could compress so much. And it wouldn't just be the brain. You'd be setting along things like physical specs so you could nail the body pretty close. But that doesn't have to be huge amounts of data. Because so much of it's going to be the same as for anybody else, or it really wouldn't matter. You don't care if your muscle cells are exactly identical to what they were before. Though that brings up the use of technology like this to heal people instantly or to add muscle mass on, right? Those extra applications of technology. If you're just doing a brain scan and it really is just like that, I can't remember how many petabytes they're saying the human brain would have its memory right now, but it's pretty big, but it's not insanely big. Something like that you probably could send down the pipeline.
Now, on the other end, how do we? I can almost understand the body scan aspect of it. Okay, and if it was atom by atom, let's that's a scan. But on the other end, you need to do assembly.
Yeah, and that's not happening.
That's not happening, right? What you remember the Fifth Element, right? when they build her body at the beginning of the movie, like 3D printing, right? You know, they do the skeleton, they do the muscle tissue and the nervous system, and then the skin, and they do that in a couple of minutes, but it's almost like a 3D printing concept is what I'm visualizing here at the other end. How long would that take? And how much energy are we talking about here to reassemble atomically our body? If we went that
it
road.
better not take more than a second, because otherwise what's happened to all the liquids they put inside your body? How about, is all your blood gushing out from the holes in your arteries to build you up? What about the liquid in your cells? You got to do that very quickly. And the problem is that means all those atoms that you're moving into place have to be moving very quickly because you're printing line by line. But they can't be moving too quickly or they'll bounce off each other when they try to assemble. Or you'll catch on fire. Or because the sheer amount of energy and speed involved being that high, if you're trying to do this in just a second, you would probably blow up the local city.
It would be. I imagine here the mechanics, and we're getting into the thermal side of pure physics. That the mechanics that would be involved, we don't have metals that could withstand that kind of heat.
Nope.
Because it would have to work so fast that mechanically in the analog world, we don't have anything that could do that kind of assembly.
Sure. You've got a printer nozzle. Now, you could put many different printer nozzles on a device so it's printing as a grid, but it's kind of like the space gun example. We say, well, I can't see you shoot a laser beam at me until the beam hits, but I can see you move that cannon. And however fast you can rotate that cannon towards me, you can't rotate it too fast or you'll rip the cannon off its housing when it turns. And no matter what special metal you make it out of, it's still got a limit as to how fast you can turn it. You try to make a 1,000,000-mile-long gun that's very powerful, but it takes a century to turn the thing to its new target.
Now, okay,
and that's kind of the same thing that applies at the printing level, only it's really tiny instead.
Right, and it would. I just can't imagine the amount of heat that would be. You're right. We would black hole into into nothing. It would just be something incredible. But now that's in our traditional way of trying to think about this. But what about the other concept that they have in Star Trek, where this is done by light and the assembly? It is just moving you from one place to another.
Now that's one of those options, like we were saying with the warp drive earlier, how it's not actually, you're not really moving, you're just sucking space and time around you. You might be able to set something like that up so that here you're standing, and then all the space between you and the destination goes away for, as you pass down there and it stops when you get to the destination. That's kind of your classic teleportation, similar to a wormhole, and that way you're just stepping out at the destination. That one works just fine, other than the problems we've mentioned about the vast amounts of energy involved in creating any of those, too. The universe doesn't like me to try to move things very fast, so it becomes problematic. Usually about the only way you could realistically do it is that mind upload into, a robot body on the end. And it might be a very elaborate android. I mean, it might be so good that you really couldn't tell the difference even as you're poking at your skin. It just depends on how good of an android does need to be for you to feel comfortable in it. Or you could maybe clone a body for somebody. If the stuff's coming in at light speed and it takes a long time to arrive, you send them the basic body template, and then we grow the body while the rest of the data is arriving and we pump you into it. Those are real potential options. People might travel the solar system in the future at light speed because they're just, uploading into a body at the other end. But that implies that they don't, they're already kind of downloaded into their current body too. That the one they're wearing here is not really their traditional body anymore, but more like an android they're walking around on here on Earth too. But that still comes down to that copying thing. You're not actually moving yourself. You're just making a copy at a destination. What happens to the original you?
Well,
you shut off.
That you. Even if you did do that, in that there are now two of you, there's one here in Los Angeles and there's one of you in Paris. At that instant, let's say you don't kill the original you, which I would assume that you would have to do. But let's say that, well, okay.
It's a great method of colonizing the universe. Like people often say, we're not going to colonize the universe because home is so nice that we're never getting any volunteers to go. Well, I say, well, if I can just send a copy of me to the destination instead, then I only need a few crewmen, maybe 1,000 folks I can mix and match, and they're going to diverge from me once they arrive, whole different life experience, right? So you got a unique colony from all those different permutations of your 1,000 volunteers. And that's an example where you could actually use, something like teleportation that way. It's a different application the same way we say, well, you could also use teleportation to heal wounds or build muscle mass or make it so you don't have to visit the bathroom, that kind of thing.
Right. But I would see in theory, the problem would be the entanglement, literal quantum entanglement of the two minds. You have two of you entangled, and it would be the voices in my head concept, right?
Well, that actually is one of those concerns we haven't completely ruled out yet with things like Orcor that suggest there might be a quantum component to the brain. But at the same time, speaking of entanglement, people often say you can use entanglement to do teleportation, and you can. We have something called the no cloning principle. The thing about teleportation via quantum entanglement is you're not actually moving the matter. You're copying the state of that person perfectly. And it does actually destroy the original when you do that. You move that data to a new place. So in a way, that would, if you could get that to work, if you could entangle an entire person, that would be one way to move somebody. Problem is, and this is that we have a heck of a problem entangling even 1,000 atoms, and you need to do like a trillion times that to do a person.
Right. And so what I just talked about, the two minds, the two consciousness that could potentially be entangled, but the original you, and you've got the new one that is, walking around on Europa or wherever you just, entangled to. But you would have possibly two sets of vision, right?
If there's a connection between the mind. I mean, we can't really discuss that from a scientific perspective because we don't have, anything to indicate that there would be a connection between those two minds. But that does bring up the other aspect. If I'm traveling this way to go visit places, how do I reintegrate those memories back in my head? Did I go on ice while my copy is exploring Mars and then it uploads that new mind state to my on ice brain, or do I find some way to reintegrate these two, and how confusing would that be?
Right.
I've been experiencing day here and on Mars, and I had to make those memories fit together.
Yeah, that's right. You would wake up with additional memories that you didn't actually physically encounter.
And from an engineering standpoint, this is doubly problematic because you're going to use some of those same neurons for your experience here on Earth and your experience there on Mars. So we got to carefully find new pathways that we can insert those memories into. Thus why we say we'd probably be easier to stick you on ice, and actually on ice too, because your brain doesn't shut down while you're asleep. So we need to freeze that thing while you're off away if we want to just copy it back.
Well, and then you would have the learning that you did in the new location. Maybe you read a book, right? Maybe you learned karate or whatever. Now,
how do we translate that onto your brain?
Right.
And if I can translate that onto your brain, why can't I translate that onto someone else's brain? So I can just take somebody's experiences from their trip to Mars and give it to everybody.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's an amazing concept. But what are you strongly suggesting here? Are you poo-pooing teleportation like you did time travel?
No. I think teleportation is one of those things you can do. I just think you have to limit it to inside that scope of, how, from a physical standpoint of what we know how to do now. Again, if we invent a wormhole, there you go, that's teleportation for you. But if we have to stay inside what we have now, technologically speaking, then you've got to go that mind upload route. And you have to find some way to put that data into a receptacle at the end and then copy it back to the original or to a new one you made back home. And I think a lot of folks would feel that really doesn't count as teleportation.
No.
But it arguably is.
It arguably is. And if we go full circle here and we go back to what we talked about earlier in the show with wormholes, and using wormholes not to necessarily go across the universe or to go to the moon, but to use them in a local sense where you would have wormholes between here and Houston, and you could use that to travel between Houston, and that would be teleportation, but not teleportation. But it would certainly be transportation, and you could, technically teleport between points locally.
Oh, that's you got to think about how far else we can do this. I don't have a teleporter in my house to go to Houston. I have one in my closet, to that warehouse I keep all my closet stuff in.
Right.
I don't have a teleporter in my house to go to Houston to go visit the fusion plant there. I have a wormhole that goes into the center of the sun to suck out heat to use to run that engine. Or I have a place I dump all my waste heat and garbage onto. I can run a really powerful heat engine on one side of a wormhole that's hot and on the side that's cold. I can go to my refrigerator, reach in, and grab a thing of orange juice from the store.
That you never left your house for.
Yep.
And the amount of energy for that, and we're at the end of the show, so let's get this as quick as possible. The amount of energy to reach into your refrigerator to get the orange juice from the store down the street or from a fresh market in Florida, an orange plantation. The amount of energy to do that, it would have to be less than the energy you would need to transport on the back of a truck, right?
Would it matter? If you can make your power plants out of stars and dump your waste heat into the void, do you care how much energy you're using? Does it matter that you might have used more energy than the whole U.S. used in the last 50 years to grab that bottle of orange juice?
That's right. Fascinating. How close, if you were to sit here and actually think about this, with the amount of technology that we have overcome in the last 100 years, it's been absolutely incredible. How close are we to seeing some of these come into play? Is it 10 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 50? Is it something that we can enjoy in our lifetime?
For so many things like wormholes, time travel, faster than light, or teleportation, I tend to think it's either we're going to get it in the next century or two, or we're never going to get it ever. Because it's one of those things where if it's possible, I don't think it's going to take us all that much longer to figure it out. So either we'll figure it out in the next couple of centuries, or it's not going to happen.
And what about, as crazy as this warp drive idea is, when NASA says, you know what, we're going to put this on the drawing board, we're going to get this from proof of concept to something very soon here. That is real science fiction Clarketech ideas. But if you were going to put, a timestamp on this, how close are we to a warp drive?
Same answer. Sometime in the next century or never.
Really? You don't think it would be 10 years?
Well, it could be that soon. I thing is, I tend to be on the side of never for that, but I tend to think that if you can find me one atom of negative matter, just one atom that we can prove is negative matter, then within a couple of decades they are tops. Because you've proven it can be done. You know what's there. You're going to throw a resource at it until you get it working. But until you've got that basic proof of concept that says this is definitely possible, here's your one atom of negative matter, we don't know if it can be done at all, and we're not really putting a lot of effort into it. So 10, 20 years after we discover negative matter, we'll have the thing. That might be now, that might be next year, that might be next century, that might be 10 days after Doomsday.
Your next episode of Future Science, you release stuff on Thursdays. What's coming up for you this week?
Space tourism. We're actually talking about that a little bit with teleportation. You can run off to Mars. We're going to look at space hotels and things in the near future. And like we so often do, we look at the near future and then we have to jump centuries ahead and see what's really on the agenda for our descendants, or maybe even us if we manage to make it around that long.
Thank you so much. Thursdays have never been the same. Thank you so much, Isaac. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks for having me on.
I know you've got a lot of work to do. Thank you so much, my friend. Isaac Arthur, incredible. Now, for everybody, it's all simple to do. IsaacArthur.net and Future Science right there on YouTube. What a great conversation tonight. Isaac, stay right there. I'll talk to you as soon as we sign off. Fade to Black's executive producer is Rita Camarion. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitola, Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intros, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast owned and copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tomorrow night, Jason Quit right here. His new drone footage that he just shot in Italy, and what is in it is incredible. We'll do all of that tomorrow night. But until then, I want everybody to be safe. Go Beckley Tepe.